Hello students, I am Dr. L.K. Das, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Department of HSS, IIT Roorkee. Welcome to another lecture of the NPTEL course Power and Politics in Contemporary India, a Sociological View. In the previous class, we had discussed the idea of passive revolution of Gramsci and how it was reanalyzed and brought to a post-colonial colonial society like that of India by Professor Sudipta Kaviraj. So, there we had discussed about the historical block, passive revolution, as well as different coalitions, correct? And how he brought society and politics together in order to understand state-society relationships, the classic political sociology framework. And he did it for a period between 1947 to the 1980s, because his article, A Critique of Passive Revolution in India, came out in 1988. In today's lecture, we have a specific problem. Now, this specific problem is about in the post-independence period, particularly till almost 1989, 1990, India remained a vibrant democracy. Unlike other post-1945 independent nations, except for a period of 18 months to 2 years when there was emergency in India, we remained democratic with a very high participation from people all across the board. But at the same time, the rate of growth was quite sluggish. It was quite low to an extent that a very pejorative term was used called Hindu rate of growth, which hovered between 2.5 to 3.5%, which was quite almost at the rate with which the population of India was growing at that period in time. That is another reason why it was called the Hindu rate of growth. So, the question is that of how political vibrancy gave rise to economic sluggishness, or in other words, when we were a democratic country, how is this democracy did not translate to a high growth society, high growth economy, like it had happened in the global north, particularly in the context of Western European countries. So, there were competing explanations for this. The liberals said that because there was over-regulation and bureaucracy. If, in other words, if like in the West, if we had completely given ourselves up to the market would have pushed our economy up and created a developed economy. Whereas the radicals or the Marxist radicals, they said that it is because of dependency and global capitalism. Dependency because the post-independent Indian state or Indian nation state was dependent on the global north for capital, for technology and for market also. So, global capitalism ensured that a country like India or a post-independence country like India would always remain dependent on them. That is the reason why we could not become developed. The third were the moralists. The moralists argued that it is primarily because of corruption, because we are so corrupt, whether it was the Nehruvian state, it was Indira Gandhi, it was Morarji Desai, or it was anybody, we are so corrupt, we have no work ethic. That is the reason why we could never grow, we could never work. So, these three groups were dominant in understanding of the post-independent Indian states or India's sluggish growth, economic growth. Bardhan, or Professor Pranab Bardhan, he looked at these arguments and brought a new dimension to it, which he called the political economy of dominant classes. and he had a problem. He had a central question or a central puzzle: why did democracy deliver compromise, not transformation? So, in order to answer this question, Pranab Bardhan rejected both the licensed Raj critique as well as dependency critique. So, he did not agree with either the liberals or the radicals. Rather, he would argue that the state is neither a complete representative of the capitalists, nor is it that it is totally subsumed under the global forces. Rather, it is a mediator among powerful classes. So, the aspect of powerful classes is the social aspect of it. The state is the political aspect of it. But when we look at it in terms of accumulation, it is the economic aspect of it. So, Pranab Bardhan is bringing society, is bringing politics, and is bringing economics together in order to interpret and analyze post-independence India's economy and society. So, Professor Pranab Bardhan is a political economist who is now working with University of California, Berkeley. And the work that we are going to discuss today is his 1984 classic text, The Political Economy of Development in India. And this, over the past 42 years, this has been one of the key texts to understand Indian society and Indian economy. Whether it is whether you are preparing for your civil services, whether you are preparing for your other competitive exams, or you just want to understand Indian society, this is a key text for you. So, I will suggest that you don't just stop with this lecture. You can actually buy this book and or download it online and read this book. It's a very fascinating, very detailed book, but very small. You can go through the entire book within a week's time and understand how he is framing his arguments. So, when we are discussing the theoretical aspects of it, whether it is by Poulantzas, by Weber, by Marx, by others, we kept on going back and forth about the nature of state, whether the state is bourgeois, whether the state is autonomous, whether the state is something else. He argues, or Professor Bardhan argues, that state is neither fully autonomous nor fully captured. So, we have to understand the grey zone in which the state works. So, this was significant because, as I said, the liberals had one notion, the radicals had another, the moralists had a third notion of it. So, instead of falling into the trap of that argument, and which we can also say that they are borrowed categories from the West, he is bringing a substantial the Indian knowledge, Indian concept of understanding Indian society. It is significant because although the idea of classes comes from the West, but he is bringing something called dominant proprietary classes. And these dominant proprietary classes are the ones who have an impact on the state and how it works. He argues that there is a mutual dependence between the dominant proprietary classes and the state, and we will get into it in a little moment. And because there is a mutual dependence between the two, so neither of them are completely autonomous or completely captured. So, even among these dominant proprietary classes, these classes are not one individual element. Rather, there are intrinsic conflicts among them. That is the reason why there is fragmented bargaining, and this creates the state the maneuvering capability. But the maneuvering capability is also detrimental to what is happening, because it is about the state is all the time engaged in conflict management, because of which there is fiscal risk and low efficiency, which as an outcome we have a low level equilibrium trap. Now let me get into detail on each one of these aspects. So what are the three dominant proprietary classes according to Pranab Bardhan? They are industrial capitalists, rich farmers, and public sector professionals or bureaucrats. So in the previous discussion on Sudipta Kaviraj, we also had industrial capitalists whom he called bourgeoisie. We also had the rich farmers, we also had the bureaucrats and professionals. How are they different from the way, how are dominant proprietary classes different from the historical block of Sudipta Kaviraj? The industrial capitalists are dependent on licenses, tariffs, and cheap credit. Now, as I said in the previous class, go back to your Bombay plan. Why the industrial capitalists had an impact on the Indian state through its Bombay plan? They were dependent on licenses, tariffs, and cheap credit, so it made them one proprietary class, right? Second were the rich farmers who came into existence through green revolution, procurement prices, fertilizer, electricity subsidies. The third are the public sector professionals or bureaucrats who had jobs, perks, and control over the resources. They were organized in nature because they had disproportionate political clout, and democracy amplified their bargaining power. Now, when you talk about the industrial capitalists, some of these capitalists were existent during the colonial period, and new industrial capitalists emerged in the post-independence period. Now, because we had a certain kind of state which was determining what kind of licenses to provide, whom to provide, and how to provide, as the industrial capitalists did not have enough capital to compete with the foreign industries, as well as they did not have enough surplus in order to expand their functions, so they wanted cheap credit. They wanted high tariffs on imported goods, so that whatever goods they are or whatever commodities they are selling in the Indian market would be more competitive than the imported goods and items. Remember, till almost like the 2000s, in India we had how many type of cars? We had one Ambassador, we had one Fiat Padmini, and we had one Maruti 800. In terms of two-wheelers, we had what? Bajaj. In terms of scooters, in terms of motorbikes, we had what? Hero Honda. Was there any competition? No. So this was also about the licenses. No foreign company was allowed to come in India and have a factory here as an independent entity. Rather, they had to create joint ventures. So Hero was an Indian company, Honda was a Japanese company. That is how they created Hero Honda and worked here till they separated after the liberalization. Same went with Maruti Suzuki. Maruti was an Indian company, Suzuki was a Japanese company. We had Maruti Suzuki. They came as a joint venture and worked till the Suzuki side of the company took over a majority stake in the company. So that is how the dependency on the government of this industrial capitalists created them as one class. The second was that of rich farmers. So these rich farmers were not the traditional aristocrats. They could be traditional aristocrats, but a majority of them were non-traditional aristocratic classes. They were in fact agrarian castes from regions like Western Uttar Pradesh, Punjab and Haryana in the north, and Kammas, Kapus and Reddys in Andhra Pradesh, the Lingayats and others in Karnataka, Marathas in Maharashtra and the Patidars in Gujarat, so on and so forth. So, they were a creation of the Green Revolution or first post-independence land reforms, during which all the lands that were taken from the aristocratic jamindars were redistributed to some of these groups. So, these agrarian castes now have land, but they were also educated. They also had an idea as to how to control certain mechanisms of the state. In the previous class, we had mentioned about M.N. Srinivas's dominant caste. The dominant castes are usually not the upper caste. Most of the times, these dominant castes are agrarian castes, and in the present context, we can call them third backward classes. So, they use Green Revolution, and through the process of Green Revolution, they created a system for themselves in which now they would also like to have procurement prices, fertilizer and electricity at subsidized rates. Because mind you, Green Revolution required high yielding variety seeds. It also required irrigation. It required, as I said, fertilizer, pesticides, and it also required market. Now, Green Revolution is also about high procurement prices, right, or high levels of investment, because there is high levels of investment. So, the procurement prices need to take care of the investment here. So, when this is taken care of, that is when you have minimum support price, MSP, and this MSP has to take care of all the investments that are being made by the farmers. And because of their class interests, they became rich farmers. They had lot of land. They could use all the Green Revolution technologies, as well as their people or people from this caste. They started getting elected to legislatures, to parliament. They also became the bureaucrats. They also became the scientists and teachers and lawyers. So, they also wanted to dominate over how the state takes care of them alongside the industrial capitalists. But unlike these industrial capitalists who were pan-Indian, the rich farmers were localized to specific areas. The third is that of the public sector professionals and bureaucrats. Now, these professionals are not just, as I said, IAS officers or the managers there. They could be doctors, they could be engineers, they could be teachers, they could be university professors, they could be other kind of low to upper level bureaucrats. Their control over resources was kind of absolute, because they are the ones who are going to give license, they are the ones who are going to give tariffs or take care of tariffs, they are the ones who are also controlling the banks. Because of their control over banks, so they have financial resources. And because they had control over financial resources, so they could also give cheap credit. So, this creates an ecosystem in which these three classes became dominant proprietary classes, because they were organized and they acted as organized interest groups to control how state are taking decisions where they're rich. So you would not call a manager or a school teacher rich, but they were rich in terms of their control over resources. They could take decisions that can totally impact the rich farmers and industrial capitalists. So there was a lot of conflict within themselves, and this conflict uh, within this coalition was also on the face and very substantial. For example, the conflict between the industrialists versus farmers, the classic case between the city versus the rural areas. If the industrialists are being given a certain subsidized the or certain subsidies on water, on electricity, on the land and others, why is it a problem when it is demanded by the farmers? But the bureaucrats, between the bureaucrats and the entrepreneurs, it's about licensing power and industrial freedom. I, as an entrepreneur or a businessman, would like to establish a factory at a certain place. But to do so, I require a license, and this license is going to be given to me by a bureaucrat. And this bureaucrat would like to delay it. And the reason for delay could be anything. It could be because of environmental clearance, it could be because of social issues, it could be because of political issues, it could also be because a particular bureaucrat would like some percentage or some share of the entrepreneur's profit. So freedom here and licensing power here, they're at conflict with each other. And at the same time, it is not just about industrialists and farmers, it's also about regional farmer lobbies. In the north, it's about wheat. In the south, it's about rice. In the west, it is about sugarcane. Who should get MSP? So that way, the coalition was always conflictual, and the state had to respond by providing them piecemeal concessions. Sometimes give something to the farmers, sometimes give something to the industrialists, sometimes give something to the wheat, to the rice and to the sugarcane growing lobbies. That is the reason why, according to the Pranab Bardhan, there was stability. There was stability in terms of political, but not in terms of economy, because what this created was that there was no it has a very long term cost in terms of underinvestment and inefficiency. In terms of public sector units, in terms of bureaucracy, there was overemployment, which essentially meant that a work that can be done by 5 persons, 10 workers were employed there. And to give or to rescue the industrialists, to rescue the farmers, or to give more and more MSPs, the state, which in the first place did not have enough capital, had to take a political decision rather than take a more technocratic decision of running the state itself or running the state's economy and society itself. So the money which could have been invested in creation of infrastructure was given to the farmers, was given to the industrialists and given to the bureaucrats and other regional farmer lobbies. So market here did not work. So the regional farmer lobbies also were clever, because they would sell some of their products in the open market if they are getting a better price, otherwise they would demand an MSP so that something is guaranteed to them. Now this is a very contentious issue, and at least in this lecture we are not going to discuss it, we will discuss about it in future. So what are the consequences for development here? So the subsidies crowd out investment. The state could not invest in electricity, in infrastructure, in irrigation facilities all across the country, because the names that I just mentioned, whether it is Western Uttar Pradesh, whether it is Punjab or Haryana or certain other areas, they got irrigation. Whereas now that they have got irrigation or certain areas got industrialized, these groups would not allow the state to invest in other areas. To an extent that, for example, if something has been produced, if wheat or rice has been produced in Punjab or Haryana, it is procured by the state and then it is transported to other states, which are also growing rice. But then the state or the central procurement agency would not procure rice or wheat from those areas or from the locals, and its own godowns will be overcrowded or overstuffed by what is coming from other states. Now, it has created an environment in which there are conflicts regionally also between what is happening in the north and what is happening in the south, in the west, in the east and in the northeast. So, the projects were also politically allocated in terms of creation of mini cities. In terms, for example, the steel cities, they were created in areas where nobody was living. So, public spending also happened in areas where politically they were beneficial, or this correlation was more significant. That is the reason why there was rent seeking behavior which led to short term gains over long term strategy. And the lack of investment by the state eventually led to the sluggish agricultural and industrial growth, because everything was short term and not long term. That is another reason why for almost 40-45 years the Hindu rate of growth persisted. So, the Indian state was trapped in stability without transformation. So, just as I have been saying about rural power, so Green Revolution created capitalist farmers, particularly in Punjab, Haryana, Western Uttar Pradesh and Maharashtra. They demanded procurement prices, subsidies, cheap credit, and significantly they were all caste based mobilization. So, their lobbying power was very strong. So, we will discuss more about this specific point in one of the classes, and that is where the demand or the clash between the industrialists and lobbying in terms of caste based mobilization worked. So, industrialists wanted the state to take care of food prices. So, if the food prices are low, that means the industrialists would not have to pay more in terms of salaries or wages to their employees. If they are not paying much to their employees in terms of salaries, that means the profit they are generating, those profit can be converted to surplus, and this surplus can then be reused for industrial expansion. Whereas, the farmers would write the food prices to be high. If the food prices are high, that means they get more benefit, and we are talking about the capitalist farmers, we are not talking about the marginal farmers, because the capitalist farmers have more in terms of investment, in terms of capital investment in their farms and ancillary activities that are associated with farms. So, their lobbying power is equated with food prices and other kind of aspects. So, food prices also for the urban poor and subsidies for the farmers. So, this is where power relationships became crucial. And similar thing were happening in the public sector and the state public sectors, in which you had overstaffing, low productivity and patronage politics. You have bureaucratic resistance to reforms and state as semi-autonomous mediator. Bureaucratic resistance to reforms also meant that the introduction of computer was delayed. The introduction of advanced technologies or automation processes were delayed, because they would lead to reduction in overstaffing. and lead to a high productivity. So, anything that would lead to high productivity and less recruitment of staffs was fought over or fought against by the public sector. So, commanding heights of steel power and finance were taken care by of the state, but uh, because of low productivity and patronage politics, there was fiscal stress and declining public investment here also. By the 1970s, most of the companies that are owned by the Indian state or by the respective state governments were running into trouble, and the state could not do anything except mediate in between these ones. So, in the post 1990s period, according to the Vardhan, we did see or we do see some kind of structural reforms, but the dominant classes are still dominant classes. There is not much of significant change in the way they have been working. So, we have industrialists, yes, but these industrialists support liberalization, but only selectively, only the one that is helpful to them, rather than that of something that is not helpful to them. So, the traditional industrialists do not support liberalization, particularly in the manufacturing sector, whereas the new industrialists who are into the IT and ITS services, they support liberalization as they could expand through the global export as well as bringing in more talent and knowledge for their own expansion and surplus creation. Then it also created division between the farmers, the export oriented works and the subsidy oriented works. So, one sort of farmers wanted to export because they were now growing crops that can be exported at a higher rate in terms of spices, in terms of many other kind of goods, whereas the subsidy oriented ones are the ones who are demanding, who have gained substantially from MSPs. So, if there is no MSP, then it affects the rich capitalist farmers more than it affects the ones who have never ever experienced MSP. Like the bureaucrats again, they resisted privatization. So, even if we have reforms, it is always piecemeal. Just imagine or go back and read how many years it took for Air India to be privatized, or the reform could be implemented there. So, there is growth, that is something that Vardhan agrees to, but now there is more inequality. So, the old coalition persists, but this coalition is now fragmented and we need to look at it differently now. At the same time, in terms of political organization, there is, during the same period we see the decline of Congress as one dominant party. So, now we have regional and caste politics, as well as middle class and lower caste are able to mobilize effectively. Now, we have caste based politics in which every region has them and they have a bargaining power for maybe 2 seats, maybe 3 seats, if not more than that. Many times they may or may not be coming to power, but even their claim for 2 to 3 seats in the legislature is very crucial for democracy to reproduce itself. So, these 4 are still continuing: free electricity, water, reservations, loan waivers, and they are continuing because without that, again populist measures cannot work. So, empowerment and redistribution is also about caste based empowerment, class based empowerment and other aspects. So, when you are talking about corruption in this case, the corruption is not just an aberration, but it is a collective entitlement, which essentially means that when you say that okay, now the state is corrupt, it is to say that all the disadvantaged castes and classes should not be getting what others have already got. So, democracy in India is stable but compromise driven, and this compromise for some groups is about the corruption, for some it is about the entitlement, and for some it is about empowerment and redistribution. It is related to which side of the dominant proprietary class you are part of, or outside of this dominant proprietary class, that you take the changes that take or interpret the changes that is happening or that are happening over the past 20-25 years. So, what are the key contributions of this work? It is about identifying the dominant proprietary classes and saying that this coalition is fragmented, coalition driven and subsidy driven. So, this coalition is not a unified whole. So, which has result, because of this dominant proprietary classes, we have low public investment, inefficiency and rent seeking. So, even if we have reforms, they are partial, politically mediated, not transformative. So, in India, development is as much political as economic. So, we cannot say that okay, if you are taking an economic decision, it will take care of political. If you are taking a political decision, it is going to take care of economic, because it is not so, as the social factor is the crucial catalyst here. If you are not looking at the social factors, neither political nor economy will hold ground. So, this is the key text. I will still suggest that you go back, read this text in its entirety. And again, these three texts, Atul Kohle's Democracy and Discontent, Rudolph's In Pursuit of Lakshmi, and Francis Frankel's India's Political Economy 1947 to 2004, they are key texts in order to understand development and its happenings and how it is happening in the past 75 years. In the next class, with the work of Partha Chatterjee, will bring these discussions together and then see to what extent there has been a transformation in the post 1990s period, or whether there is a certain kind of transformation or not. So, in that work we are going to, it is both broad based as well as gives us a detailed understanding of the Indian society. Thank you.